my aunt stood at my grandfather's funeral, crying fake tears. She had a piece of paper in her hand that she thought would make her rich. She didn't know I had a secret my grandfather had left me, the one thing that would prove she was a liar and a thief. My name is David, I'm 38 years old, and my grandfather, Arthur, was the anchor of my life. He wasn't just a grandfather, he was my mentor, my confidant, and after my own father passed away when I was a teenager, he was the man who taught me how to be a man. We spent countless hours in his dusty workshop in his small house in Savannah, Georgia. Him teaching me how to work with wood, me listening to his stories about his life, his late wife, and the family he had built. He was a man of quiet integrity, a man whose handshake was his bond and whose word was gospel. Which is why when he was gone, the treachery that followed felt like a desecration of his memory. The betrayal came from a predictable place, my Aunt Carol. She was my father's younger sister, a woman who had spent her entire life consumed by a bitter, gnawing jealousy. She was a classic narcissist, always the victim in her own stories, always convinced she was owed more than she had. While my father had built a modest but happy life, Carol had chased get-rich-quick schemes, married and divorced two wealthy men, and was now living far beyond her means, propped up by a mountain of debt. In his final years, my grandfather's health declined. He had Alzheimer's, a cruel, slow-moving thief that stole his memories but never touched his gentle spirit. My mother and I were his primary caregivers. We were there for the doctor's appointments, the late-night confusion, the difficult days. Carol would visit once every few months, usually when she needed money. She'd sweep in for a weekend, put on a grand performance of being the doting daughter, take a series of smiling photos for her social media, and then present my grandfather with some sob story about a can't-miss investment opportunity. He, in his fading state, would often give her what she wanted, and she would disappear again for months. We tried to intervene, but she was vicious, accusing us of trying to turn him against her. It was a painful, ugly dynamic we simply had to endure. When he passed away peacefully in his sleep, the grief was immense, but there was also a sense of relief that his struggle was over. The funeral was a blur of sorrowful faces and whispered condolences. And through it all, there was Carol performing her role as the grieving daughter with theatrical perfection. The first sign that something was deeply wrong came a week later, at the reading of the will. We all gathered in the stuffy office of my grandfather's longtime lawyer, a man named Mr. Thompson, a kind, elderly gentleman who had handled our family's affairs for 40 years. My grandfather's wishes were simple and known to all of us. His house, a beautiful historic property worth a significant amount, was to be sold, and the proceeds, along with his considerable savings and investments, an estate worth nearly $3 million, were to be split evenly 3 ways, between my mother, my Aunt Carol, and myself, in my late father's place. It was fair. It was what he had always told us. Mr. Thompson cleared his throat, a look of profound discomfort on his face. "Before we begin," he said, his eyes avoiding ours, "I must inform you that the will I have on file, the one Arthur and I drafted in 2012, has been superseded." A confused silence fell over the room. My mother looked at me, a question in her eyes. "A new last will and testament was filed with my office 3 months ago," Mr. Thompson continued, his voice strained. "It was brought to me by Carol. It is signed by your grandfather and witnessed by 2 individuals I do not know. Legally, this is now the binding document." I looked at Carol. She was staring down at her hands, a picture of false humility, a predatory stillness about her. Mr. Thompson began to read. The legalese was dense, but the intent was brutally clear. In this new will, the 3-way split was gone. My mother was left a token amount of $10,000 for her years of service. I was left his old collection of woodworking tools, a deeply personal and insulting gesture. And the rest, all of it, the house, the savings, the stocks, the bonds, nearly $3 million, was left entirely and solely to his beloved daughter, Carol, in recognition of her unwavering love and devotion. The air was sucked out of the room. My mother let out a small, strangled gasp, her hand flying to her mouth. I just stared at Carol, a cold, sickening wave of understanding washing over me. 3 months ago, that was her last visit. That was when my grandfather's dementia had been at its worst, when he was barely lucid, lost in a fog of confusion. She hadn't just been visiting to get a handout. She had been visiting to pull off the ultimate heist. "This is a lie," my mother cried, her voice trembling with grief and outrage. "Arthur would never do this. He loved David. He loved our family." Carol finally looked up, her eyes filled with perfectly rehearsed crocodile tears. "I know this is difficult to understand," she said, her voice dripping with fake sympathy. "But Daddy's final months were a time of great clarity for him. He told me he was worried about you, about David. He knew I was the only one with the financial sense to be a proper steward of his legacy. It was a performance so audacious, so utterly shameless, it was almost brilliant. She had a story for everything. I was silent. My mind was racing. The signature, the witnesses. How had she done it? "Mr. Thompson," I said, my voice dangerously calm. "The signature, does it match my grandfather's?" The old lawyer sighed, a deep, weary sound. "It's shaky, David, consistent with his condition at the time. And the witnesses are a notary and a paralegal from an independent firm." "On paper," he said, looking at me with apologetic eyes, "this document is ironclad. Challenging it would be incredibly difficult and expensive." That was it. That was her checkmate. She knew we didn't have the tens of thousands of dollars it would take to hire a forensic document examiner and drag this through a lengthy, ugly probate court battle. We were trapped. I looked at her, and she allowed herself a small, almost imperceptible smirk of victory. She had won. She had stolen my grandfather's legacy and spat on his memory, and she was going to get away with it. The days that followed were a waking nightmare. My mother was a ghost, drifting through her house in a state of shocked grief. It wasn't about the money for her, it was the betrayal, the idea that her in-laws' final act was one of such cruelty. I knew it wasn't. I knew in my bones that my grandfather had been manipulated, his illness weaponized against him. But knowing it and proving it were two different worlds. Carol, meanwhile, moved with sickening speed. She initiated probate, got an executor appointed, and began the process of liquidating my grandfather's assets. She put his house on the market, the home he had built with his own hands, the place where all my best memories lived. She was erasing him, erasing us. I felt a profound, suffocating sense of helplessness. The legal system was on her side. The evidence was on her side. I spent my nights poring over copies of the old will and the new one, comparing signatures until my eyes burned, searching for a flaw, a mistake, a crack in her perfect crime, but found nothing. And then, one night, sitting alone in my grandfather's now empty workshop, surrounded by the tools he had left me, the scent of old wood and oil in the air, I remembered a promise. It was from about a year ago, one of his more lucid days. We were sitting on his porch, and he was looking out at the garden, a rare moment of clarity in his eyes. "David," he'd said, his voice quiet but firm, "things are getting foggy for me. I need you to promise me something. Don't let your Aunt Carol take advantage of this family. Don't let her tear down what your grandmother and I built. Protect your mother." I had promised him I would, and I had failed. A new feeling began to burn through the grief and helplessness. Determination. This wasn't about the money. This was about that promise. I wasn't just going to fight her. I was going to dismantle her. I was going to find the truth, and I was going to use it to expose her for the parasite she was. She thought her document was ironclad, but my grandfather was a wise man, a creature of habit and detail. Somewhere, in the 40 years of his life documented in that house, she must have made a mistake, and I was going to find it. My investigation began with the two witnesses, a notary named Susan and a paralegal named Mark from a firm across town. I hired a private investigator for a few $100s to do a background check, a small price to pay for a potential lead. The result was a dead end. They were clean, legitimate professionals with no connection to my aunt. Carol had been smart. She had used strangers, professionals who could testify that my grandfather had appeared of sound mind when he signed. It was a classic move for someone orchestrating this kind of fraud. I turned my attention to the house. Carol had put it on the market, but it was still empty, the keys with the realtor. Under the pretense of retrieving some final personal items, I got access for a few hours. I walked through the silent rooms, memories at every turn, but I wasn't there for nostalgia. I was hunting. My grandfather, for all his dementia, was a man of routine. He kept everything: receipts, letters, bank statements. He had an old roll-top desk in his study, a beautiful piece of furniture he'd built himself. Carol and her lawyers had already been through it, taking the official documents, but what about the unofficial ones? I started going through the small, unlabeled cubby holes and drawers. And in a small hidden compartment in the back, I found a stack of old checkbook registers, a carefully handwritten record of every check he had written for the past 20 years. I took them all. That night, I sat at my kitchen table with the registers and a pot of coffee. I was looking for one specific date, the day the new will was signed. I found the page and I saw it. Check number 3451 made out. To Susan Miller, Notary Public, $450. It was the payment for notarizing the will. But that wasn't the discovery. The discovery was the check right above it. Check number 3450, made out to Dr. Adams. For his regular, weekly house call. Dr. Adams was my grandfather's geriatric physician, the man who had been managing his Alzheimer's care for years. My heart started to pound. I pulled out my phone and called him. I explained the situation, the suspicious will. "Doctor," I asked, my voice trembling slightly, "do you keep notes from your visits? Can you tell me your assessment of my grandfather's mental state on that specific day?" There was a rustling of papers on the other end of the line. "Ah, yes. I have it here," Dr. Adams said. On that day, Arthur was having a particularly bad episode. He was experiencing severe sundowning, was disoriented, and did not even recognize me or his daughter, Carol, who was present. "In my professional medical opinion," he said, his voice firm, "he would not have had the testamentary capacity to understand, let alone sign, a complex legal document." I felt a surge of adrenaline, of triumph. This was it. This was the weapon I needed, the expert medical opinion that would blow her story out of the water. I thanked the doctor profusely and hung up. I had her. The next day, I contacted Mr. Thompson and told him what I had found. He was stunned. He immediately filed a motion to challenge the will, submitting Dr. Adams's official medical assessment as evidence. A court date was set. The 2 months leading up to the hearing were excruciating. Carol's lawyers came at me with everything they had. They tried to discredit Dr. Adams, claiming he was just a bitter old man who was colluding with me. They filed motions to have his testimony thrown out. It was a war of attrition designed to bleed me dry emotionally and financially. Carol, in a move of pure calculated cruelty, had the locks on my grandfather's house changed, barring me from the property completely. She was trying to break me, but the memory of my promise to my grandfather was a fire that would not go out. On the day of the hearing, the courtroom was cold and intimidating. Carol sat at the opposing table, looking smug and confident, whispering with her expensive lawyer. She believed her professional witnesses and her ironclad document would be enough. Dr. Adams gave his testimony, and it was devastating. He calmly and professionally detailed my grandfather's severe cognitive decline, his lack of capacity on the day the will was signed. But Carol's lawyer was good. On cross-examination, he twisted the doctor's words, painting a picture of a man whose memory could be faulty, whose opinion was just that, an opinion. He brought out his own paid expert, a doctor who had never met my grandfather, to testify that a person with Alzheimer's can have moments of lucidity. I could feel the judge's certainty wavering. The ironclad document, with its legitimate notary and witness, was a powerful piece of evidence. My case was strong, but it wasn't a slam dunk. I could see the path where we could lose. But I had one more piece of evidence, one final secret my grandfather had left me. In his workshop, tucked away in the back of a drawer, I had found his old Bible, a worn leather-bound book he read every night. Inside the back cover, he had a habit of writing down important thoughts, quotes, and dates, a kind of informal diary. I had asked Mr. Thompson to submit it as my final piece of evidence. The judge was skeptical. "What is the relevance of this?" she asked. "Your Honor," I said, my voice clear and steady, "please turn to the final page." Mr. Thompson handed the Bible to the bailiff, who placed it in front of the judge. She opened it, and I saw her eyes widen. "On the last page, Your Honor," I said, "is an entry written in my grandfather's hand. It is dated the same day the new will was signed. It is one of the last things he ever wrote." The judge read the entry aloud, her voice filling the silent courtroom. "February 12th, she read. A day of fog. Carol came to visit. She is a good girl, but she worries me. She had me sign a paper, said it was for her new investment club." The courtroom was absolutely still. In his final lucid moments, my grandfather had given me the truth. He hadn't signed a will. He thought he was signing a permission slip for his daughter's garden party. It was proof of her deception, of her fraud, in his own hand. The judge looked up from the Bible, her eyes burning with a cold rage. She looked at Carol, whose face had gone a ghostly white. The smirk was gone, replaced by the raw, ugly face of pure panic. It was over. The ironclad document was shattered. Her perfect crime was exposed by the shaky handwritten words of the man she had betrayed. The judge threw out the forged will, reinstated the original, and then did something I will never forget. She looked at the district attorney who was present in the courtroom and said, "I believe the state will want to look into this matter further, for potential charges of elder fraud and perjury." That was it. My aunt, who had tried to steal $3 million, was now facing prison time. I had won. I had fulfilled my promise. Justice, true and final, had been served, and my grandfather's legacy was safe.